In a small town in India, nestled between narrow alleys and colorful houses with crumbling paint and hand-painted nameplates, was a neighborhood called Shantivan. Despite its name, which meant forest of peace, the tranquility there was more of a surface illusion than a lived reality. Shantivan was like many Indian middle-class colonies, a tightly packed web of lives, tangled with history, habits, and hush-hush talk. Every sound traveled, every action echoed, and every resident had eyes that saw more than they were meant to. Among the town's modest homes stood house number 17, a pale yellow two-story building with green windows, the paint flaking at the edges. It belonged to Mrs. Renu Sharma, a retired school teacher, known as much for her discipline as for her curiosity. She had taught half the neighborhood's children in her day, including the now-grown sons and daughters of her fellow residents. But these days, she spent her time not on blackboards and lesson plans, but on her terrace with a cup of chai and a rotating cast of like-minded women. At exactly 4 p.m. every day, like clockwork, Renu would climb the stairs to her terrace with her teacup in one hand and a biscuit plate in the other. There, she'd be joined by her two closest friends, Mrs. Kamla Verma and Mrs. Neelam Chawla. Kamla had a son working in Dubai and a husband who rarely spoke. Neelam had a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and though she claimed she didn't like to gossip, she always knew the most. Their get-togethers, on paper, were simple. 3 old friends catching up over chai. But to those who listened from the balconies below, they were the unofficial broadcasters of Shantivan. "Did you see Mira's daughter last evening?" Renu would begin, often setting the agenda. "The one in the blue jeans?" Neelam replied, eyes narrowing with familiarity. "Out after dark again. Who knows where she goes at that hour? Wears lipstick too. Bright red. And that phone in her hand, always texting. We never did that at her age," Kamla added, shaking her head with mock concern. What none of them knew was that Mira's daughter, Ananya, was attending coaching classes for NEET. Her dream was to become a doctor and serve in rural India, inspired by her father, who had passed away from a preventable disease. Her nights were filled with formulas, mock tests, and late bus rides, not parties or rebellion. A few houses down, inside the same locality, Renu's own son, Rajiv, sat in his room. He was 27, an engineering graduate, once filled with promise. But after being laid off 6 months ago, Rajiv had fallen into a silence that deepened each day. He was afraid to tell his mother, afraid of her disappointment, afraid of what she might say, or worse, what she might say to others. He watched as his mother dissected other families' stories every evening, with laughter and judgment so quick it barely spared breath. He feared being next. Rajiv spent his days applying for jobs, battling anxiety, skipping meals, and staying up late into the night reading self-help forums. He had no one to talk to, and even if he did, he wasn't sure he knew how to begin. One morning, a commotion broke the usual quiet of the colony. Arjun, a 16-year-old boy from the neighboring block, had been taken to the local police station. No one knew the full story, but that didn't stop anyone from filling in the blanks. "Drugs," Neelam hissed the same evening on Renu's terrace. "I always said he looked wild. He used to ride that bicycle so fast, no manners," Kamla added. "This is what happens when parents are too lenient," Renu concluded. "Always on the phone, no discipline." But the truth? Arjun had seen a wounded street dog limping near the highway. He tried to help the animal by tying a piece of cloth around its leg. A passerby misunderstood the scene, thought the boy was harming the dog, and called the police. Within an hour, it was all clarified. But the gossip took on a life of its own. Arjun stopped going to school for 2 days. His mother, Mrs. Kapoor, received sideways glances at the market and no longer attended the Temple Bhajan group. The words spoken on the terrace had made their way into whispers, and whispers made their way into judgment. And still, every evening the terrace echoed with more names, more judgments, more false truths. Ananya had tolerated it for long, but that Thursday, something changed. She had just returned from her class, tired and hungry, when she overheard her name being mentioned from the terrace above. "These girls today," Renu was saying, "dressing up like that for tuition? Or is it even tuition?" Ananya's hands trembled as she placed her books on the table. She climbed the stairs with firm steps and appeared at the terrace door. The 3 aunties turned to her, startled. "Excuse me, auntie," she said, voice steady but strong. Why do you talk about other people's children like this? Silence. Do you know where I go every evening? What I do? Or what I dream of becoming? Neelam tried to recover. Beta, we were just talking, not seriously. Ananya didn't back down. You talk and people believe. Arjun tried to help an animal and he was called a criminal. Rajiv Bhaiya hasn't left his room in months. Do you even know why? Renu's expression flickered. You were a teacher, Auntie. You taught values. But this is not kindness. She turned and left, leaving behind a silence that hung heavier than any words. That night, Renu didn't eat dinner. She sat by the window, remembering her own past, how people had whispered about her when her husband drank, how isolated she had felt, how words had hurt her in ways silence never could. She knocked on Rajiv's door. It opened slowly. Beta, she said, voice breaking. Are you okay? Rajiv, stunned, sat down and told her everything. The job loss, the depression, the fear. She listened, really listened, and held his hand the entire time. The next evening, something new happened. On the same terrace, the same chairs were laid out, but this time, the circle was larger. Meera came. So did Mrs. Kapoor. Even Ananya joined, with her books in hand. There was no gossip that day. They spoke about pressure, about expectations, about misunderstandings. They spoke of loneliness, of dreams, of the heavy burdens women carried in silence. Renu proposed something new, a weekly gathering called Suno Samjho Samjhao. Listen, understand, share. Not for gossip, but for growth. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes. But slowly, week by week, the chairs filled up. Younger women came. Teenagers, too. They shared stories, fears, and hopes. They discussed real problems, education, safety, mental health. And something changed. The terrace, once a place of whispers and giggles at others' expense, had become a place of healing. The mirror behind the curtain had been dusted off, and for the first time, the women of Shantivan looked into it and saw themselves. The gossip didn't vanish overnight. Old habits die hard. But now there was a new voice among the old ones. A voice of awareness. A voice of choice. Because when you truly understand another person's pain, gossip becomes impossible. And peace, even in a place called Shantivan, becomes finally beautifully real.